For the soap makers out there, take a look at this cold process blend and see if you can identify how unusual this looks when I add the lye water solution and start to blend. Now this immediately curdles and it looks just like cottage cheese. And then I'm just going to keep casually blending it down until it smooths away into the texture I want. So what's going on here? Is it seizing? Is this a false trace? Nope. Stay tuned. This is Thermal Mermaid. Okay, if you have a couple of batches of cold process soap under your belt, you might notice that this reaction is unusual. And if you get something that curdles this fast, it's usually no bueno and you have to work fast to save your recipe. But that's not what's happening here. Here, we're making a soft shave soap, which is actually a cream soap that uses a blend of lyes. I'm using both sodium hydroxide and potassium hydroxide in this recipe together. Now the sodium hydroxide makes a solid bar and the potassium hydroxide makes a pure liquid soap. But when we use a hybrid mixture of these lyes, we'll get anything in between textures, something from a pudding or maybe to a chalk. And the ratio that you use will determine the type of texture that you get. So I want a soap that's basically a solid bar, but it melts as soon as it comes in contact with water, and then it lathers up real quick so that it behaves like a nice shave bar. And so to get this, I'm going to give you the perfect ratio of lye to use. Now remember, the lye ratio governs the texture of the soap. You can absolutely use your own recipe if you have a favorite, or you can download and print this recipe if you're a member of the Thermal Mermaid Crafters community in the cold process section of the recipe directory. So from your dashboard, you go to the recipe section and then you click on the cold process category, and then you're going to find the one that's labeled Christian's Shave Soap. And all the information that you need is there to print this recipe. Also, if you do want to learn how to formulate a dual lye soap by hand and you want to see how the math works, then you can find an additional video in lesson 7.5 in the Soap Makers course that's also in the members section of the Crafters community. That's a little bit too technical for this video, but that information is located in the links below if you do want to explore more deeply into these formulas. So this recipe is a cold process. I actually prefer to create shave soaps that are hot process. I like cooking soap, and whenever I'm adding stearic acid or waxes into anything, cooking is my preferred way to do it because I can make sure that I get everything melted down without having to second guess the temperature. So it's really more about convenience. One difference is when I'm making a hot process recipe, then my batches are limited and smaller because I'm working within the confines of just the crock pot. So if you want to upscale this, you can do this with a cold process recipe very, very easily. It's really no hassle. It's just a few little adjustments, and then you can make a much larger batch. Now, when you're doing this in the form of a cold process, again, it's just as easy, but what you want to do is melt those hard oils and those waxes together first. You want to get the oils perfectly blended in. Once the hard oils get melted into the waxes, make sure that you get those soft oils in there right afterward. And when everything is nice and warm and it's all blended down, what happens is it's much harder for those waxes to re-solidify if you get those oils blended in there well. So that way, once you have everything combined properly, you can take your time and you can allow those oils to come down to a little bit of a lower temperature, and you can allow that lye to settle before you start blending it. So it's really just a matter of organizing how well you put your oils and waxes together and taking your time. But it really is just as easy to do this in a cold process version, which is what we're doing in the example that you see here. Now the lye ratio is surprisingly a 65 to 35% blend, with the potassium hydroxide being the 65% and the sodium hydroxide being the 35%. So it's about a 2-to-1 ratio. Now that may be a surprise because the bar in our final product is really a solid bar of soap. it just softens up very easily and nicely, but when it's dry, it's really stored as a solid bar of soap. So it might not be completely intuitive that the higher percentage of lye is the lye we would use for our liquid soap. Now, I've experimented with several different percentages, and with this ratio, it seems to be an absolute perfect blend. If you do go higher in the sodium hydroxide, the bar takes longer to soften and lather up, so it's not as convenient to use. If you go higher in the potassium hydroxide, that soap becomes muddy and it becomes more like a cream soap that you would want to keep in a jar. The ratio that I've given you here keeps the soap solid while it's dry, and then it does its job nicely and it softens while it's being used. Now, once we combine the lye water with the oils, it really does start off behaving in a very peculiar way. But this is neither a false trace nor seizing either. This is just the natural properties of how this lye combination behaves when it's being combined with the oils at room temperature. Once you get through this stage, you simply just keep blending and allow it to go until you get a rich, creamy texture. Now, it's important to transport this into the mold right when it becomes a smooth, rich, creamy texture, because this is going to start to harden up pretty quickly. And you can do this in one of two ways. You can either fill your soap dishes immediately and use that as your mold, or you can create a mold these up, and then pop them into your dishes as refillable soaps afterwards. Now, these little wooden bowls that you see, I just found these on Amazon. They're pretty ubiquitous. If you just type in shaving dishes or shaving bowls, you can get them in wood, you can get them in ceramic, all sorts of different materials. But they're also refillable. You don't necessarily need to dispose of these. So you can always mold one in the dish, and then you can make a refill soap in bulk. Now, there are plenty of molds out there for these circular pucks, but pretty much everyone knows that a Pringles can is absolutely the perfect shape and size. Now, I don't buy a lot of chips, so when I do get my hands on one of these cans, I like to strengthen it with some crafter's tape, which is what you're looking at right here. And these last for years. So for $1 or $2, you can get the perfect mold for this project, and you can use it 100 times before you need another one.